just his lifestyle, not just his teachings, not just the way he died loving and forgiving his enemies, but fourthly, the way he rises from the dead.
Cliffe Knechtle debates with atheist Matt Dillahunty at Texas State University. Matt was the former president of the Atheist Community of Austin. This engaging debate focuses around the question, is belief in the Christian God rational? Comment down below which point resonated with you the most. Now let's get into the debate.
So gentlemen, with no further ado, each of you will have 8 minutes for your opening remarks.
A lot of people say to me, Cliff, I wish I had your faith. And what they really are saying is, Cliff, I wish you could be so intellectually naive. I wish I could be so intellectually naive to believe all this garbage that you've apparently been able to swallow. But I've got a bit too much on the wall intellectually, and I can't believe in God, I can't believe in Christ. I believe in God, I believe in Christ, because of the evidence. What is the evidence that God exists? First piece of evidence. The Big Bang tells me that the universe is not eternal, there's a beginning. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Not everything has a cause. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. If you hear bang, and I ask you, what caused that? And you say nothing, that's irrational. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Second reason that I believe in God, that God, some type of God exists, is because the evidence of order and design points to a designer. This shirt does not point to a hurricane passing through a cotton field. This shirt points to a tailor who sewed the thing together. A BMW does not point to a hurricane passing through a metal junkyard. It points to a rational mechanic bringing amazing order in a BMW. You do not get the unabridged dictionary from thousands of monkeys banging on typewriters over thousands of years. Instead, you get the unabridged dictionary from an intelligent mind communicating and bringing order. Third piece of evidence for God's existence is DNA. There is more information packed in the DNA of a single cell than there is information packed in 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I am not saying that the Encyclopedia Britannica is paper, glue, and ink. It's the information in the Encyclopedia Britannica that points to an intelligent mind. In the same way, it's not the material of DNA that points to an intelligent creator. Instead, it's the information, the amount of densely packed information in the DNA of a single cell that points to the existence of some type of God. If you and I are walking up and down the beach, and we come across ripples in the sand, and you ask me, hey Cliff, how did these ripples get here? I'll say, obviously the ocean. The waves, coming up on the sand, coming back, made the ripples. And that's rational. But if as we're walking down the beach, we see in the sand, John loves Mary. And if you ask me, hey man, how'd that get in the air? And I say to you, oh, the waves did it. That's stupid. Why? Because densely packed information demands an intelligent mind. There is more information, densely packed information, in the DNA of a single cell than there is in 3 sets of the 30-volume Encyclopedia Britannica. That demands an intelligent mind. Fourth piece of evidence for the existence of God is the innate human drive for meaning. All of my atheist friends are wonderful people. All of my atheist friends have created meaning for their life. But almost none of my atheist friends are willing to live as if that meaning is totally subjective, relative. Instead, they attach real meaning to their life. Why? Because obviously you and I as human beings thirst for meaning and purpose in life. Shakespeare wrote, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You can't live that out. Because when you grapple with the meaninglessness of life that is intellectually consistent with atheism, you have to grapple with the fact, my life means nothing ultimately. What that means is, I could become like Adolf Hitler, or I could become like Mother Teresa. It ultimately doesn't matter. But you see, you can't live that out. Instead, we, as human beings, insist upon attaching meaning to our lives. Jesus Christ pointed out, you were created by God for a purpose. And that purpose is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That makes rational sense. It makes so much sense that almost every single one of my atheist friends says, yeah, I think love is probably the most important thing in my life. Very good, my atheist friend. You're onto something. Guess what? That love is not just a biological urge. That love is not just a sex drive. That urge is not just a drive to preserve the genetic pool. That urge, that desire, has been placed in you by God. And you know it makes sense because you're so committed to living your life as if there is meaning and purpose to life. Next piece of evidence that God exists is the resurrection, historical resurrection of Jesus Christ. I did not make up God. I didn't make up Jesus Christ. Jesus was an historical person who really lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead. The Catholic Church didn't make up Jesus. Dan Brown did not make up Jesus of the Da Vinci Code. No, Jesus was a real person. And we have eyewitness testimonies. Matthew, Mark, John, Peter, James were eyewitnesses of this historical Jesus. And they wrote what they saw, and they wrote in the first century. Why? Because Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch in 95 AD, quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke in his letters. The fact that he quotes them in his letters in 95 AD shows unequivocally that Jesus obviously lived, that eyewitnesses who saw Jesus obviously wrote about him. Too many people have thought, oh no, the Gospels were written hundreds of years later. One manuscript find, the John Rylands manuscript in the John Rylands Museum, Manchester, England, is a fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18. And it is dated between 117 and 130 AD, which clearly points us to the fact that the Gospels were written in the first century. This Jesus Christ we read about as an historical person lived the type of life that in my best moments I try to live. Guess what? I fail. I try to live like Jesus. I blow it consistently. If you don't believe me, talk to my wife, my sons. They will verify that. Jesus Christ didn't blow it. He lived it out. And in John chapter 8, you look into the faces of his enemies and say, which one of you guys can prove me guilty of sin? And his enemies were silent. The Apostle John, Jesus' closest friend, lived with him for 3 years. In 1 John, he writes, in Jesus is no sin. Gosh, that demands my respect. And then when I read the Sermon on the Mount, I see, wow, the ethical teachings of Christ are profound. He's an ethical genius. Then I watch him die on a cross as I read the Gospels. And I see that at the moment of his most excruciating pain, instead of cursing his enemies, he prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And my respect for him grows. But fourthly, and most importantly, not just his lifestyle, not just his teachings, not just the way he died loving and forgiving his enemies, but fourthly, the way he rises from the dead makes it a no-brainer, guys. He is reliable. Now, the reason that the Christian God is so rational, the reason that belief in Christian God is so rational, is because, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus is not risen from the dead, we're fools for believing in him. I love that. That means that faith in Christ is, you can falsify it or you can verify it. Think carefully, examine Christ.
Am I on? Yeah. I apologize, I'm not going to walk around. I've been sick for a couple of days. Thanks so much for having me here. Is belief in a Christian God rational? This isn't just the question we're here to debate this evening, it's the question that ultimately led to my own atheism. Just over a decade ago, when I was a Bible-believing Christian, I was convinced that the answer was an unequivocal yes. And my goal was to affirm that and share it with the world. Hopefully I can explain in a way that everyone can understand why my mind has changed. First, the fact that we're still debating these claims after thousands of years of debates between both laymen and scholars should demonstrate that the only reasonable answer to this question is no. Can you think of any other category of claim that over thousands of years has not only failed to make any marked improvement in its supporting evidence, but has actually become less credible as we learn more about the universe we inhabit? It is by definition irrational to believe such a claim. The claims of Christianity were constructed, as the claims of other religions were, to fill the gaps in our knowledge. When we find evidence-based answers, the answer has never been, God did it. And while this should eliminate God as we fill those gaps, instead the specific claims of Christianity and other religions morph chameleon-like to conform with the facts, or the facts are just flatly denied. I don't know precisely what arguments Cliff plans to offer tonight. Obviously, I wrote that ahead of time. It's likely that we'll hear some version of the cosmological argument, the argument for design, perhaps a little about the anthropic principle, maybe the moral argument. These and other classic arguments for the existence of God have been trotted out time and again. They fall in and out of favor, and they're occasionally repackaged in order to obfuscate the fallacies and avoid the classic responses. But let's be honest, this is a prime example of starting with a conclusion and attempting to construct and reconstruct an argument that supports it. The rational mind does not lead the evidence where it would like to end up. It follows the evidence wherever the evidence leads. I'll try to address these arguments if they're presented and there's time in the format, but it's important to note that even if all of them were valid and sound, and they're not, they would be irrelevant to tonight's question. Those arguments do not and cannot confirm the reasonableness of Christianity. Those same arguments are trotted out by Muslims, pantheists, deists, and apologists of other religions, because they at most lead to a generalized God concept that does not confirm anything unique to Christianity. I don't know how familiar any of you are with the Drake equation, but briefly, it's an attempt to estimate how likely or how many other intelligent species are likely to exist in the universe. And no matter how accurate the Drake equation is, it would be irrational to attempt to use that generalized claim to support the specific claim that there are reptilian aliens masquerading as humans and controlling the world. And yet, time and again, I run into Christian apologists who attempt to use these generalized arguments to prop up the specific claims of Christianity. If we're going to address Christianity's rationality, we need to look at the specific claims and the evidence supporting them. Unfortunately, this means that we're talking about analyzing the Bible and historical text to determine if its claims are rational. And as with any ancient source, this is a bit problematic. Some would argue that the Bible's accuracy on mundane claims and the sincerity of its authors is enough to justify believing its miraculous claims as well. That seems to be the height of irrationality. Cliff and I could each list 10 things that we honestly, sincerely believe, but the truth of each of those 10 claims is that each of those 10 claims are all independent, and our sincerity and our honesty are irrelevant to the truth of those claims. Truth is not impacted in any way by the number of people who believe something, the strength of their convictions, or how long an idea has been popular. What does it mean to say that a claim is rational? Does it mean that we've proved that it's actually true? No. Does it mean that we're absolutely certain? No. Absolute certainty is an irrelevant distraction. When we identify that a claim is rational, all we're saying is that it's met its burden of proof that the evidence for the claim is sufficiently strong that an objective application of reason would conclude that the claim is more probably true than not. You can believe things to varying degrees of certainty, and the rational mind attempts to ensure that the confidence level is proportional to the supporting evidence. Additionally, one's actions tend to be apportioned to one's confidence level. I have more confidence in our new car than our old car, so when push comes to shove, I'm driving the new car. What you say about your beliefs can differ from what your beliefs actually are and even what you're aware of. And I might say, oh no, I have all the confidence in the world in our old car, but the truth comes from what I actually end up doing. All claims are not equal. If you tell me that you saw a cow on the way into this debate, that's a very different claim from telling me that you saw Jesus floating around the campus causing amputated limbs to regrow. One of those claims is ordinary and the other one is extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Anecdotal testimonies are not sufficient. When we're trying to determine how reliable historical documents and claims are, we're in a bit of a sticky situation. Which experts do we trust and why? After all, we can't all be experts, and the study of history often depends on individual historians doing their best to determine how accurate a claim is, only to find other historians disagreeing, and absent a time machine, and there's no clear path to truth. There are, though, new possibilities. Historian Richard Carrier, for example, is adopting the use of, or advocating the use of Bayes' theorem as a means of determining the historical probability of reported events. He outlined the case for Bayes' theorem in his book, Proving History, and his next book is going to make use of this method to evaluate the historicity of Jesus. He's going to use Bayes' theorem to evaluate the information from the seriously limited sources that mention Jesus. That said, the existence of an individual is mundane. The existence of the supernatural is not, and no historical account should be considered sufficient on its own to rationally justify extraordinary, supernatural, miraculous claims. I'm not asserting that the supernatural and the miraculous are necessarily impossible, but until we have a reliable confirmation of this type of claim, hearsay evidence cannot be sufficient. We need to first demonstrate that the supernatural is possible before we can determine how probable it is. And then, depending on how probable it is, we can begin to determine what sort of evidence should be sufficient to justify rational belief. It would be irrational to believe the supernatural claims of the Bible based solely on the hearsay claims that would not be sufficient in a court of law, and many of the sources would be excluded as hearsay. The burden of proof rests firmly on those who assert that Christianity is reasonable. And if all we're presented with are generalized arguments, hearsay accounts from ancient books, and anecdotal testimony from ancient sources, we simply cannot find that belief in the Christian God is rational. When we hear a claim, there's a heuristic model that we run through in our head. It's something that we train ourselves to do for our entire lives. Every decision we make and every belief that we hold plays into this. And we ask ourselves questions like, is this claim consistent with reality as I understand it? What's the evidence for this claim? What do I know about the person making this claim? Are they honest? Do they have something to gain? If I accept this claim and I'm wrong, what is the impact to me? If I accept this claim, what current beliefs that I have will I have to change based on this new belief? And is the evidence for those existing beliefs stronger? In which case, it would be irrational to abandon stronger beliefs that are supported by stronger evidence in favor of new beliefs that are supported by weaker evidence. As David Hume taught us, reject the greater miracle. Here's the crux. The Christian God should have an understanding of the burden of proof and the nature of evidence. That he continually fails to supply the sort of evidence that would rationally justify the belief demonstrates that either this God doesn't exist or isn't willing or capable of providing a rational justification for its existence. In either case, belief in the Christian God simply is not rational.
All right, Pat talked about the fact that we're here debating the issue shows that God doesn't exist. Excuse me? We debate all types of issues. We debate issues in science, in politics, in history, in psychology, and I can assure you, the fact that we debate an issue says nothing about whether truth exists or not. The fact that we debate an issue is healthy. We're seeking to struggle through what does the evidence point to. And the fact that we debate something doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or that historical facts don't exist. Rather, we're pushing ourselves to think more deeply. What does the evidence point to? Matt says, as knowledge of the universe increases, the God of the gaps shrinks. Good. I'm happy for that fact. But I can promise you, when you read the Bible, you will find no science in the Bible. That's why when Matt says, as science increases and grows, God shrinks, he's wrong. Why? Because science doesn't prove God exists. Science doesn't disprove God exists. God is not a scientific question. God is a philosophical, theological question. Yes, unfortunately, religious people, some Christians included, have tried to use science to prove God's existence. That is intellectually dishonest. Why? Science is based on what you can observe. Can you see God? No. Can I see God? No. Therefore, it's dishonest intellectually to say, I can prove that God exists scientifically, and it's equally dishonest for an atheist to say, I can disprove God exists scientifically. Why? Because you can't observe God, it's impossible to scientifically verify whether God exists, or to scientifically verify that he doesn't exist. Why? Because God is not a scientific question. Now that shouldn't blow any of us out of the water. Why? What are Matt and I doing right now? We're not having a scientific discussion. We're having a philosophical discussion. And if you narrow truth and the search of truth to simply scientific truth, then this debate wouldn't be happening. Matt's not using science. I'm not using science. We're using logic and reason. Guess what? Logic and reason is not science. It's a rational, thoughtful discussion we're having, but it is not a scientific experiment. Matt also says that the Bible, probably isn't accurate. Well, wait a second. I would encourage you to ask yourself, how do you determine the historical accuracy of any document? And I hope you'd come up with some tests. For myself, I've got 4 tests that I use on any document that claims to be historical. Internal consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence. If you don't like my tests, no problem. Just come up with your own tests that you use to determine whether any book, be it the Bible, be it American history, African history, Asian history, any book is reliable or not historically. Apply those tests to the New Testament Gospels, and I'm convinced if you got fair tests, they'll pass it with flying colors. Now, listen carefully to Matt. The only reason that you cannot accept the Bible as historically reliable is because it contains miracles. And therefore, because it contains miracles, we all know it's false. Baloney. That is a philosophical presupposition of naturalism that Matt is espousing. Philosophically, obviously, if naturalism, the philosophy of naturalism is true, then obviously miracles don't happen. Because you have to have a supernatural God to change a law of nature to cause what you and I call a miracle. Fair enough? So, it's intellectually dishonest to say, well, I can't accept the New Testament because Jesus walks on water. And we all know that it's impossible to walk on water. Yeah, we do know that a high percentage of the time, you walk on water, you'll sink. But if there's a supernatural God who created the laws of nature, who created water in the first place, then it's not irrational to say, wow, this supernatural God performed a miracle. He became a human being and he walked on water. That is not irrational. Obviously it's irrational to think that Jesus walked on water if there's no supernatural God. Then obviously miracles are stupid, really dumb. But that's a philosophical issue. Now, when you read the Gospels, understand its history. Understand that you better be open to the philosophical position that there's some type of supernatural God, maybe. And then if you allow for that, a miracle is not stupid, it's not irrational, it's the supernatural God who created the natural laws in the first place, changing a natural law, performing what we call a miracle. Now, Matt said, truth is not determined by the number of people who believe. Very good, we agree. Jesus Christ is not the truth because a lot of people believe in him. And I can promise you, if you ever asked me, Cliff, why do you believe in Jesus? And I said, well, because a lot of people believe in him. That'd be idiotic. Really stupid. Truth is not determined by majority opinion. You know, at one point in human history, the majority of people thought the earth was flat. Did that make the earth flat? No. Guess what, folks? Just because a bunch of people believe something does not make it true. And that's why those of you here tonight who think that truth is determined by culture could not be more mistaken. I can promise you, just because a lot of people in a culture believe in sute, the burning of a widow after her husband dies, doesn't make it right, doesn't make it good, doesn't make it the thing to do. Truth is not determined by majority opinion. Truth is that which is real. And the challenge for you and me as thinking human beings is to get in touch with what is real.
True, so apologies for coming off arrogant or condescending, but what I heard was a strawman version of almost everything that I actually said. Right from the very beginning, he claims that I said the debate shows God doesn't exist. I've never said this. Did I say that? No, what I said was the fact that we've had this debate and had it for so long with no progress could be enough to say that this is not irrational belief. Not that God doesn't exist. If you can't just straw man what I'm saying when I'm talking about rational argument, pretend like I said that, oh, we've had a debate, so God doesn't exist. I love debates. I wouldn't be doing a debate. My point wasn't about a debate. It was about the length of time that we have had this same debate, making absolutely no headway, and in fact, losing headway. The claim that God is shrinking and the explanation to get over, well, I'm going to skip that for a second. When we talk about God, it's funny, Cliff says we can't see God. And yet, I have this feeling that Cliff, like most other Christians, believe in a God that actually manifests in reality, because if he doesn't, then there's no point in having this discussion anyway. How did anybody ever come to the understanding or knowledge of the existence of this God if it doesn't manifest in some way in reality? Cliff says we're not talking about science here, we're talking about philosophy. Logic and reason is not science, excuse me, but logic and reason applied to the evidence is in fact science. That's what science is. When you're talking about a God that manifests in reality in some way, we attempt to use science to confirm the historical claims. It is not pouring solutions into beakers, but it is most definitely science. Archaeology, if you go tell an archaeologist that they're not a scientist while they're confirming the events of history, and I think you'll be in for an interesting discussion. Several times there was this portrayal that that I said that something was false, when actually what I talked about was it not being true or not being able to demonstrate that it's true. There's a difference between these two things. If you think about it, the example I've used many times is a courtroom analogy. And when somebody's on trial for murder, the fact of the matter is that they are either guilty or innocent. But we don't ask people to evaluate that question. We ask them to evaluate the question of guilt, because we understand how to establish the burden of proof. And saying that voting that you think that somebody is not guilty is not the same as claiming they are innocent. And saying that the God of Christianity is not reasonably justified is not the same as saying that God doesn't exist. And saying, as an atheist, I do not believe that God exists, is not the same as me asserting no God exists. There's a difference between I do not believe God exists and I believe God does not exist. Those are different claims. And we seem to get a little muddy here in the confusion there. We talk about, well, why do I believe? He presented his reasons for believing, the classical arguments, which if I have time before I get through, I'll add some quick notes on. But he said he didn't just believe because a bunch of people believed. But the only argument that he presented on behalf of Christianity was the resurrection. Why do you believe the resurrection? Because a bunch of people believed it and reported it. You have no evidence of the resurrection. We have no way to verify this happened. We don't have a time machine. And we are implying, or the Christians are implying, that because these people sincerely believed something and reported it and even died for it, then therefore it must be true. That is simply not logical. It is not rational. Reality doesn't work that way. We can say, I have confidence in it, and I kind of think maybe so. I'll tell you this, I love my mother, and I'm friendly with Richard Dawkins. People are familiar with the brilliant scientist, hardcore atheist. If they both came to me and said, hey, I had this vision of Christopher Hitchens last night, I'm not going to believe either one of them, even though I know them to be trustworthy, even though I know that I would believe that they experienced something and were attempting to relay it, but I cannot establish a causal relationship between what they're proposing, that some God did something, and the actual event. There's no way to link a causal relationship between God and resurrection, other than an argument from ignorance of, well, we have this claim of a resurrection, I'm going to assume that it's true because these people are trustworthy. How could this happen? I don't know. Must be God. That's not the way reason works either. On the classical arguments, the design argument, we recognize design not by complexity. Actually, simplicity is a hallmark of design. We recognize design by contrasting it with that which is naturally occurring. It's patently absurd to run around to living things that have a mechanism for reproducing themselves and implying that they're designed in the same way that a building or a bridge or whatever is designed, when all of the evidence for buildings and bridges point to them being designed and no evidence points to them occurring naturally. And in the case of human beings and planets and solar systems, all of the evidence points to them occurring naturally by natural laws, natural rules. No evidence points to them actually being designed. I think there was one more classical argument that I wanted to make sure I was, this idea about meaning and purpose in life. I have 30 seconds. The fact that you think you have a desire for meaning and purpose in your life in some transcendent sense doesn't mean it's actually there. The fact that you have a hunger doesn't mean there's actually food. This is simply a fallacious argument start to finish. When we talk about meaning and purpose in our life, how many of you would like somebody else to pick your major for you? Because that is the type of meaning and purpose that Christianity is claiming you need to have. You have a God-imposed purpose. You have a God-imposed. Wouldn't it be preferable to make your own choice? But your preference doesn't matter to the truth.
Now we'll move to the section of the debate where each of the speakers will have the opportunity to ask questions of the other. So for the next 6 minutes, we have one question.
All right. Matt, thank you so much for being here tonight. You've made point consistently that you're a rational human being, and the reason that you cannot believe in God or the Christian God is because of lack of evidence. So my question is simple. What are you living for? And what is the preponderance of evidence, this overwhelming evidence, that what you are living for is true. Because obviously you said the reason you cannot believe in a Christian God is because of lack of evidence, which clearly implies in order for me to live for something or someone, there's got to be X amount of evidence. So the question is simple. What are you living for? And what's this preponderance of evidence that shows convinces you that whatever it is you're living for is true?
Whatever it is that I'm living for, what shows that it's true, I don't know that it's a truth claim. I don't know that there's anything that could show that it's true or that it actually is true. I think we're talking about a classification error. If I determine what I want my life to be, there is no truth to that other than this is what I've determined my life to be. That's exactly the point that I was making, that I don't have, nor do I see any need for, nor do I see any actuality of an externally imposed truth, or a meaning, sorry.
Okay, but you obviously have decided that something's worth living for. You wouldn't dress the way you do, you wouldn't live your life the way you do. Sure. Now, the reason that you cannot accept God or Jesus Christ is because of lack of evidence. Fine, I understand. But when you say that, you're implying that before I believe something, X amount of evidence has to be produced. So my question remains, what are you living for, and how has X amount of evidence been produced for you to show you that this is true and worthy of you living for it?
As I said before, not all claims are equal, not all claims require the same amount of evidence. There are some things that are evident unto themselves. I am defining that this is my meaning and purpose to life. I am not declaring that it is true in the sense that you're talking about. As I said, I don't even think that it can be true. It simply is what I choose to do. Now, why? It's because I have seen evidence that living one's life in a certain way is better than living one's life in other ways. That there are actual benefits that make life more enjoyable, more worth living.
And what is that?
What is what?
What is it that you're living for, and why are you living for it?
Okay.
The question remains on the table. I need an answer.
I am living, first of all, because I can't help it. But second of all, I continue to live because I have a desire to learn new things and to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. Because I am convinced by evidence that if you live your life believing as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible, you will lead a better life. We have seen the evidence for this in that people who believe false things are prone to very dramatic errors, like running into traffic. Life is generally preferable to death. If you can't agree on that, then we can't even have a discussion about meaning and purpose or morality.
July 1881, Charles Darwin wrote a letter to a man named Mr. Graham. And in this letter, Charles Darwin writes, in light of the fact that our brains are simply highly developed monkeys' brains, why do we trust our brains to tell us the truth? You seem to be communicating that my rational mind tells me what's worthy of me living for. If you believe that your mind is simply a highly developed monkey's mind, why would you trust the thoughts of a monkey? Why would you trust your own thoughts if that's what you believe? That the rational mind is simply an accidental collection of atoms of a highly developed monkey's brain?
Well, I don't, the accidental characterization I don't actually agree with. Evolution is not an accidental process. It's guided by natural selection, and that's the reason why things fit their environment and we perceive design. But the question of why would I trust this slightly advanced monkey's brain? And it's because I don't, first of all, I mean, we can't ever get around the problem of hard solipsism. I can see that right from the get-go, but we don't need to. Because I have the ability, for example, how do I know that this is a bottle of Coke Zero? I can use my senses and I would have to possibly trust them. I disagree with philosophers on whether or not it's properly casing because we know our senses can be fooled, and so we seek independent verification from others. And so I learn things by watching others just as monkeys do. And I live my life in the way that seems to be, not as a declaration of absolute truth, but seems to be the best way to enjoy life and be healthy and proceed, just as monkeys do.
Okay, and that's my basic problem, your answer. Why? Because you started out by saying, the reason I cannot believe that God exists and the reason I can't believe in Jesus is because of lack of rational evidence. But now when I ask you the question, what are you living for? And what is this preponderance of evidence that supports what you're living for? I get no evidence. I just get, this is what seems to me to be best. This is what I feel like. This is what I choose. Fine. But don't you see the intellectual hypocrisy, Matt, of your position? You're saying the reason that I can't believe that God exists, that I can't trust in Christ, is because of lack of evidence. Fine, I got no problem with that. But what that implies is, in order for me to trust someone, not to believe it's true, but just to trust someone or something enough to live for it, I've got to have X amount of evidence. Now I'm waiting, Matt, to hear X amount of evidence for whatever it is you're living for, that it's reliable, it's not going to let you down.
Well, I never said it wasn't going to let you down, and you're looking for evidence at a level that is just patently absurd. If you're trying to claim that the resurrection of an individual is a claim that demands evidence that is on par with how do you want to live your life, we're at an impasse, because I think those are absolutely different category of claims.
We're not at an impasse.
So, first question, should anyone accept Christianity as Christianity? Wow. Oh, it's a slip, you just lost. Should anyone accept... should anyone accept Christianity as rational and true based on your personal testimonial claims?
No. Nobody should believe in Jesus because I have a testimony.
Okay.
The only reason people should believe in Jesus is because they see the evidence points to his reliability.
Okay, if we can't believe it based on your testimony, why would we believe it based on the testimony of the gospel authors?
Because I never saw Jesus, but Matthew, Mark, John, Peter, and James saw Jesus. They are in a much better place to tell you about Jesus than I am. I never saw Jesus, they saw it.
Well, you never met my dad, but my mom has, and if my mom were to claim that my dad died and came back, clearly we wouldn't believe her based on just her word.
Speak for yourself.
Well, okay. You don't know my mom either, but I mean, would you believe her if you knew her to be trustworthy? Would you believe your wife if she told you that her father died and came back?
Man, I can promise you, my brother transplants kidneys and livers at the Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. And I can promise you, sir, there are people who have been pronounced medically dead.
Yes.
And there have been
that's clever, but
resuscitations.
it's not the same thing as being dead and buried for multiple days and rising bodily and ascending to heaven.
Good point.
We're not going to make, equivocation fallacies here. So, appeals to popularity, the plural of testimonial is not dated. So just because we happen to have a lot of different claims from trustworthy people, that alone doesn't make the claim believable, does it?
In the United States, you can die because an eyewitness saw you murder somebody, they testify in court, and you can die because of it. I can promise you, eyewitness testimony is very important. These students pay a lot of money to study history, which is based on eyewitness testimony. It's a legitimate form of knowledge.
I didn't say that it wasn't. My question is to whether or not it's rational and true. The fact that somebody claims something in and of itself is not sufficient, correct?
Well, you know the answer to that. Obviously, if I claim to be Superman, it doesn't mean I'm Superman.
Sure. How do we tell which parts of the Bible are true and literal, and which parts aren't?
By studying literary style. If something's parable, you know it's a parable. If it's hyperbole, you know it's hyperbole. If it's historical narrative, you read it as historical narrative. If it's apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation, you read it as apocalyptic literature. You know very well you'd flunk out of this institution if you went to biology class and treated it as poetry. And you also know you'd flunk out of this place if you went to English class and treated it as chemistry. You've got to learn to distinguish between literary styles: scientific, historical, poetry, symbolic.
How do we tell who's got it right and who's got it wrong?
By studying the text, the context, by studying the historical context, by finding out how many eyewitnesses saw this event. In science, by studying whether the experiment works not in just San Marcos, Texas, but also in London, England, or in Calcutta, India. So you have different ways to test whether something is true or not.
So is Genesis literal? Like a six-day creation literal?
I can promise you, if you study Genesis 1 carefully, you will notice that it is Hebrew poetry. Which means if you go to a poem with a stopwatch, that's intellectually dishonest. You cannot go with a stopwatch to a poem.
That's fine. I mean, you keep promising me things. You can promise me all damn night long. It doesn't have to be more effective than testimonials. So, in your view, you look at Genesis 1 as poetry. There are others who would disagree with you, and you're saying that they're wrong, which I agree with you. I happen to agree with you on this one. But there are other individuals who believe in a God, the same God you do, who
Right.
believe this revelation, who disagree with you on the issue of Genesis.
So what?
Okay.
What difference does that make?
What the difference that it makes is that this is a book where there are two people who believe many of the same things about it, and one thing very, very different. And we have no way to distinguish between the two.
Oh, gosh, that's scary. Sir, just because there are different interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran doesn't mean that the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita are not communicating some very clear claims. So you better learn to read for yourself. You better not take it from me. You better not take it from Matt. You as a thinking human being better go to the source document, in this case the New Testament Gospels, or Genesis, and read it for yourself. Studying literary style, reading in context. You've got to do your homework, guys. I've got to do my homework. Matt, you've got to do your homework.
I've done my homework, so why doesn't the Christian God just come down and reveal himself and clarify these issues for us?
Because he's God, which means he's not a little toy or plaything that you can jerk around, or I could jerk around.
How is it jerking around to demand the person who wants you to believe something to actually make a demonstration of its truth reasonably and responsibly?
Because after he has done exactly that, made a demonstration of his reality responsibly, rationally, and thoughtfully, for someone to say, that's not enough, is a game. It's a game. It's a dishonest game, intellectually dishonest game.
So because somebody might, after God does all this, say, oh, I still don't believe, that's enough of a reason for God to not bother doing it for all the people who sincerely and honestly seek out this sort of evidence and would require this sort of evidence in order to be intellectually, rationally justified.
Matt, the overwhelming evidence is that around the world, every culture has some type of belief in God or gods. Your belief system, sir, is a very small group of people who happen to be very white, very Western, and very enlightenment in their thinking.
And bearded. Thought my time.
No, not bearded, but very white, very Western. That is where you find atheism. You do not find atheism in South America, in Asia, in Africa.
That's time.
Yep.